The release of the first Quake came as a relief that it sold well enough for id Software, pushing the 3D plane of FPS gaming into the stratosphere, and also becoming the blueprint for competitive FPS multiplayer over the years. A year later, id Software were on the cusp of developing another shooter, with more advanced gameplay and better graphics to boot. But they struggled with giving it a title, and they had no assurance whether a new IP would be successful or not. So for the sake of convenience, they decided to name their new title Quake 2. I love the first Quake for its simple but satisfying gameplay, its mix of Lovecraftian sci-fi and medieval elements, and its extensive modding capabilities. And I wanted more of this, something like Doom but infused with cosmic horror and fast-paced gameplay, which Quake provided. Quake 2, however, decided to present something else entirely, while still being a fast-paced shooter. After the first title was released, Romero had left the group, moving on to another studio and eventually working on another shooter that was infamous among the old-school FPS community, Daikatana. Kevin Cloud would step in and spearhead the next Quake title, making the decision in the process to reshape the series, putting it into a different universe unrelated to the first one. Remember the Lovecraftian entities that sent forces across dimensions in the first Quake? Well, that's all gone now. Instead, Quake 2 favours a more traditional sci-fi setting, something that you would see in films like Starship Troopers, Star Trek, or even films like Event Horizon. The focal point of Quake 2 is that humanity launches a planetary invasion towards a hostile alien force known as the Strogg, a vampiric cybernetic army that invades planets and harvests tissue and organs in order to survive. They also assimilate other species to further expand the collective. During the initial attack, your character ends up getting shot down, crash landing into the stronghold of the Strogg army. Your objectives are to neutralize the big weapon that is keeping the human fleet in check, and your one-man army carnage begins. The story is pretty straightforward. You go from place to place completing a number of objectives, as you continuously make your way to the eventual goal, killing the number of Strogg that get in your way. But as I had said before in my review of the first Quake, and the first two Doom games, the story wasn't the biggest priority here, but rather the gameplay, which was the series' biggest strength. As for the Strogg themselves, you could think of them as like the Borg from Star Trek, unified in a single goal and merciless in their execution. Conceptually, I like the Strogg. They're like cybernetic vampires in a way, but without the fangs and the need to drink blood with a wine glass. They harvest for the sake of survival, with total disregard for the pleas and cries of their enemies. But the universe of Quake 2 compared to the original I don't find as interesting, whereas the first game had limitless potential in regards to where it could go. To an extent, Quake 3 and Champions would return to it more or less, while still connecting the universes of Quake 2 and 4, but without the single player experience to flesh it out any further. Quake 2's world is well made, but I feel like it should have been its own separate game, and funny enough it almost was, but pressure got the best of id Software, leading them to slap the Quake title on this game. The levels consist of industrial complexes, going from place to place and even back and forth. Speaking of which, the level system is different this time around. In Quake 2 you no longer have the episodic structure of the first game, but instead, you have units, which comprise of a sequence of levels. When the unit is completed, you are then transported to the next one, which is indicated by a cutscene showing your whereabouts. And yeah, the cutscenes don't hold up too well here, since this was early 3D tech work we're talking about here. The game's setting is strengthened by the atmosphere of the Strogg's presence and their technology. The backdrops outside, and even to the point of going through levels where human soldiers are captured, tortured, and ultimately processed in a number of gruesome and horrific ways. I wasn't too big personally on the way this game makes you go back and forth in terms of the level structure, and oftentimes it's really easy to get lost, considering that most of the levels look pretty much the same, which was a problem that seemed to carry over from the first one. To its credit though, it does offer more variety later on, taking you to the stronghold of the main villain, and even out in space. But still, it doesn't do enough to resolve the repetition of the game's levels. The maps all have secrets, traps, interactive buttons that affect the environment, and a number of bad guys to clear. You clear the room of bad guys, follow the objective, rinse and repeat for pretty much the entire campaign. All in all, the story is passable. The setting is interesting enough, at least in terms of the Strogg themselves, but it's not as interesting as the first Quake's universe. Later after its release, id Software made 2 mission packs for the game, The Reckoning and Ground Zero. You take on different Marines during the assault of the Strogg homeworld. each with their own objectives. They both offer more Quake 2 content, and not just that, but also more weapons, enemies, and even power-ups for that matter. You can pick it up for pennies on the dollar on Steam. They both are worth looking into if you want more Quake 2 single-player content. This is the real reason why people still play Quake 2. In fact, it's the main reason the Quake franchise has been so well regarded in the annals of FPS history. Its gameplay striked a balance between being difficult but fair, fast-paced and fun at the same time. And in Quake 2, you get the same deal as you did in the first one, albeit slightly slower. What you'll notice from the get-go is that the pace has slowed down somewhat. The enemies aren't moving at blitz speed, their hit scans often force you to take your time, and clearing the rooms more carefully as a result of that. In saying that though, the game can be really fast if you know what you're doing, but for a first time player, you're expected to take things slower than usual. Quake 1 and 2 are both games I go back and forth with. From a technical standpoint, Quake 2 is much better. The animations of weapons and enemies are more dynamic and stand out more. You could destroy infrastructure and open pathways. You also even had an inventory system that managed your ammo, your power-ups and your weapons, something that the first game didn't have. In fact, with the power-ups themselves, you could have multiple power-ups at the same time and activate them whenever, whereas in the first one, the moment you touch them, will activate immediately. At its core, Quake 2 pretty much plays the same. You pick up supplies, you find secrets, kill enemies and move from place to place. Of course, the way you go about it is different this time, no collecting 4 runes or any of that shit, but instead your actions are determined by your current objective, which can range from obtaining power cubes, destroying or shutting down a system, finding alternate routes, or even just finding the controls to open up the entrance to the next room. The more I played Quake 2, the more I came to enjoy it. It was the same feeling I had in the first Quake, where I felt a growing satisfaction as I became more familiar with the gameplay loop and its mechanics. For 97, this is a really fucking solid shooter. You have fluid movement, a weighted but smooth feeling of the weapons themselves, a dynamic range of enemies that this time share a uniform identity. Speaking of which, the Strogg come in different shapes and sizes. You have your usual grunt types, slightly bigger versions with one of them running at you, and the other that gives the ogre a run for its money, firing 4 grenades in a row instead of 1. You also have flowing drones, large gigantic tank structures, even one in particular that fires a railgun at you. Eventually though, you will come across more unique enemy types and particular bosses, but they come in later on in the game. With the majority of the game's roster, most of the Strogg enemies here are pretty much hit scan based. In the first one, this was rarely an issue because the grunts and enforcers in that game were often only fought in the first levels of each episodes, and the majority of the game's enemies were projectile based, save for the Shambler. In Quake 2, however, you'll get hit pretty often, as in all the time pretty much. But the game won't leave you wanting for health packs and ammo unless you're getting carried away, that is. And as for the weapons, you have a really good selection here, save for the blaster. Quake 2 starts you off with this weapon, and for the most part it's unreliable. Its only saving grace is that the ammo is infinite, which can help if you're low on ammo in general, but its drawback is that the trajectory of the weapon is inconsistent. Oftentimes you'll be missing even though your crosshair is dead center. Only use it if you have no other option. Eventually you'll get your hands on a number of returning weapons like the shotgun, super shotgun, grenade launcher and rocket launcher, which have all been redesigned to fit into the new universe. They feel different from their Quake 1 counterparts, but to be honest, I don't like them that much. They do however animate much nicer, while at the same time feeling too sluggish for my taste. I suppose this was done in an effort to add a modicum of realism into the game's hard sci-fi setting. Also, the rocket launcher is pretty slow as well. Most of the time it feels like the rocket itself is in slow motion. The only weapon I like out of the bunch is the super shotgun for its damage output, but that's about it. As for the new roster of weapons, you've got hand grenades, which in the beginning can come in handy early on, but gets replaced by the grenade launcher once you obtain it. The machine gun and the chain gun replace the nail guns from the first Quake. Personally, I hate these weapons. The machine gun's recoil often has you micromanaging the direction of the mouse so you stay on target, and the chain gun, while relatively powerful, it chews for ammo so quickly because of the wind-up build, as well as the velocity that increases as you continue firing the weapon. The railgun is great though, probably my favourite weapon in the game. When id Software were making Quake 2, they conceived the idea of making a weapon that functioned like a rocket launcher but acted instantly, hitting its target the moment it fired. It's one of the most iconic weapons in the whole series, making appearances in every Quake entry afterwards, and also inspired other arena shooters to make their own adaptations of the weapon. Case in point, the shock rifle from Unreal Tournament. The Hyper Blaster is my third favourite weapon, which is after the Super Shotgun being my second favourite. Like the chain gun, it has a wind-up mechanic after it fires. The weapon's surface rotates as you continue firing, but when you stop firing, you have to wait for the rotation to stop, which can be annoying sometimes even though I appreciate this attention to detail. The gameplay is more refined but slower, even though slightly. The weapons are well designed but are mixed in their execution, with some being, not quite as good and the others being heaps better, like the railgun. The enemy design in general is more consistent and share the same identity. And while Quake 2 does feel slightly slower than Quake 1, it's still a pretty fast game, especially if you dive into the multiplayer, which is a whole other game entirely. The game's soundtrack was done by Sonic Mayhem, so no 9 Inch Nails, no Trent Reznor this time around. Instead of the quiet but unsettling ambience of the first Quake, you instead have the we're about to kick some ass style rock and metal music. It still holds up pretty well in my opinion, especially if you're into the industrial stuff. Quad Machine is the highlight track of this game, and is one of the most memorable tracks written for any shooter in my opinion. In terms of weapon and enemy sounds, much better than the first one. They have a lot more clarity and have a higher frequency in the middle of the action, which is to be expected since id Software had a whole year to improve on the sound design from before. Graphically speaking, it's aged pretty poorly. Environments still have a bit of detail left, but everything else from the weapons to the enemies all look muddy and blurry. And to get the most out of the game, you have to apply unofficial patches to allow for higher resolutions, so that it doesn't look like complete shit. However, you can get mods like Quake 2 XP, or even the RTX version of Quake 2, to circumvent the dated graphics. But even then, the game isn't that much of a looker anymore, and games like Duke Nukem 3D and even the classic Doom games have aged far better due to their art style. Graphics are okay, the sound is for the most part good. At the time, it was a step in the right direction, and like the first game, would help push 3D tech forward for future FPS titles. When I spoke about the first Quake, I mentioned it having an extensive modding platform, but doing more research into Quake 2's modding community, I was surprised to see what this game was actually capable of. You have mods in not just the single player, but also the multiplayer, either enhancing or completely overhauling the experience entirely. As I have said about both Doom and Quake, they were both the yin and yang to each other, one having a strength over the other. In the case of Quake, its multiplayer has always been the most popular aspect of the overall experience, and in Quake 2, it's no different here. In '98, it was the most popular online game for that year, hosting tournaments and LAN parties so that people could frag one another in person. Nowadays, the numbers are pretty small. I managed to find a game and could tell that it was going to be a sweat fest, considering that most of the people that still play Quake 2's multiplayer are long-time veterans. But that's not to say that you'll have a bad time, mind you. In fact, the multiplayer is actually really good, and is enhanced with the use of modding, something that not a lot of multiplayer games have the benefit of. You can find Discord servers that house Quake 2 sessions, and also give frequent updates on upcoming mods for the game. To get the full experience of Quake 2, this is what I would do, if I were you. Finish the main campaign first, then check out the multiplayer. After that, start tinkering with the mods. It'll make you appreciate the game even more. Quake 2 is a game that invoked mixed feelings among the community. Some were disappointed that they favoured a more traditional sci-fi setting this time around, rather than the Lovecraftian-inspired setting that infused sci-fi and medieval aesthetics. But others had embraced the more updated sense of gameplay and movement. It has an enjoyable campaign with an interesting enemy faction, an addictive multiplayer that's still supported by a small number of long-time fans, and a decent number of mods to back it up. Roughly 2 years later, it would eventually get overshadowed by the most well-known entry in the series, Quake 3 Arena. That would be a purely dedicated multiplayer experience. Do I like the second Quake more than the first one? Not quite. It's not quite as fast. A lot of the weapons feel pretty sluggish to me, even though the animations for them are quite smooth. And I don't like the back and forth structure of the game's levels, because most of the time it can get often confusing due to the levels being, pretty much the same in terms of looks. But do I still enjoy Quake 2? Absolutely. I still find myself playing this game on occasion when I have a desire to go back to the classics. Quake 2 is another great entry in the franchise, albeit a different one at that. Definitely pick it up. It's cheap as. Thank you for watching.